In 1892, a quiet act of resistance on a Louisiana train would change the course of American history. A man named Homer Plessy bought a first-class ticket, took his seat, and refused to move when ordered to leave because of the color of his skin. What followed was not just an arrest, but a legal battle that climbed all the way to the highest court in the United States. When the Supreme Court ruled against him in 1896, it did more than decide one man's fate. Gave constitutional approval to a system that would shape everyday life for millions for generations to come. That ruling, known as Plessy v. Ferguson, introduced a dangerous idea into American law: separate but equal. On paper, it sounded harmless. In reality, it opened the door to one of the most rigid systems of racial control the modern world has ever seen. From train cars and classrooms to parks, hospitals, libraries, and even cemeteries, segregation became the rule rather than the exception. Jim Crow was no longer just prejudice, it was policy, enforced by courts, lawmakers, and social custom. This story is not only about the past. It is about how laws can normalize injustice, how language can disguise inequality, and how warnings from history are often ignored until the damage is done. Jim Crow did not arrive overnight, and it did not survive by accident. It was built step by step, decision by decision, and defended as reasonable, necessary, and even lawful. Before we go deeper into how this system worked and what it did to everyday life, take a moment to support this channel. If stories like this matter to youstries that uncover hidden truths and connect history to the present, please like this video, subscribe, and share it with others. Your support helps keep these conversations alive. Now, let's go back to that train, that courtroom, and the moment America chose segregation as the law of the land. Long before Homer Plessy stepped onto that train in 1892, the battle over segregation was already unfolding in quieter, less remembered moments. One of those moments belonged to Daniel Desdunes, a young man whose name rarely appears in textbooks, yet whose actions briefly cracked the legal foundation of racial separation. In early 1892, Desdunes boarded a train traveling from New Orleans to Mobile, Alabama, deliberately taking a seat in a railcar reserved for white passengers. Like Plessy after him, he was acting according to a carefully planned challenge, supported by a network of activists who understood that the future of segregation would be decided not only in the streets, but in courtrooms. At the time, the legal landscape was unsettled. Reconstruction had officially ended, but its promises had not yet been fully dismantled. Desdunes' case turned on a crucial distinction: interstate travel. His attorneys argued that when a passenger crossed state lines, state segregation laws should not apply, because only Congress had the authority to regulate interstate commerce. For a brief and unexpected moment, the courts agreed. The Louisiana Supreme Court ruled that the Separate Car Act could not govern interstate passengers, effectively admitting that segregation laws had limits. The charges against Desdunes were dismissed, and for those watching closely, it felt like a narrow but meaningful victory. This decision mattered far beyond one train ride. It suggested that segregation was not inevitable, that the law itself contained cracks through which equality might still pass. For activists. So, it was proof that careful legal strategy could slow, or even reverse, the spread of racial separation. Yet this fragile progress existed in a hostile climate. Public opinion was shifting, political will was hardening, and the national appetite for protecting black rights was fading fast. The Desdunes ruling did not inspire reform. Instead, it triggered resistance. Within just a few years, that brief opening was closed. When Homer Plessy's case reached the U.S. Supreme Court, the justices were no longer interested in limits or exceptions. The court chose clarity over complexity, authority over fairness, and in doing so, it reversed the direction history had briefly taken. By declaring segregation constitutional as long as facilities were equal, the court swept aside earlier distinctions, including the reasoning that had protected interstate travelers like Desdunes. What had once been a legal question became a settled doctrine, enforced not cautiously, but confidently. The contrast between Desdunes and Plessy reveals something essential about how Jim Crow took hold. It was not born fully formed, nor was it universally accepted at first. It advanced because each challenge that failed made the next one harder, and each ruling in favor of separation emboldened lawmakers to go further. The system hardened not because it was just, but because it was convenient for those in power. Courts that once acknowledged limits now provided cover, and lawmakers moved quickly to translate ideology into everyday rules. By the time Plessy's case was decided, the window that Desdunes had briefly opened was gone. What followed was not merely a return to segregation, but its expansion into a way of life. The law no longer asked whether separation was justified. It assumed it was necessary. In that sense, Desdunes' forgotten victory makes Plessy's defeat even more significant, because it reminds us that history could have turned differently. The warning signs were there, written into early rulings and early resistance. But once the Supreme Court spoke, the path forward was set, and the era of Jim Crow moved from possibility to permanence. Once the Supreme Court had spoken, segregation no longer needed to justify itself. The ruling did what earlier laws and customs could not do alone. It transformed separation into something routine, predictable, and enforceable across daily life. What followed from the late 1870s through the mid-20th century was not a collection of isolated rules, but a carefully maintained environment in which nearly every ordinary action carried an invisible boundary. Jim Crow did not announce itself with a single sign or statute. It revealed its power slowly, through repetition, until separation felt less like an imposition and more like the natural order of things. Travel became one of the earliest lessons in this new reality. Train stations, railcars, waiting rooms, and later buses were divided in ways that left no room for confusion. Movement itself was regulated, teaching people where they could sit, where they could stand, and which entrances they were permitted to use. These divisions were not merely logistical. They were symbolic, reinforcing the idea that even shared destinations required unequal paths. What began on the railroads soon extended outward, shaping how people moved through cities, towns, and rural spaces alike. Education followed the same pattern, but with longer-lasting consequences. Schools were separated by law, yet rarely by resources in any meaningful sense. Buildings, textbooks, and opportunities reflected a hierarchy that was never openly acknowledged but always clearly understood. Children learned early that opportunity itself was divided, and that ambition had to be shaped around imposed limits. These schools did more than teach lessons. They transmitted expectations, quietly preparing students for the roles society had already assigned them. Housing, too, became a mechanism of control. Neighborhoods were defined not only by economics, but by enforced boundaries that dictated who could live where and under what conditions. Access to safe housing, sanitation, and public services followed the same pattern seen elsewhere, reinforcing inequality through geography. These divisions shaped social life, determined access to jobs, and limited the networks through which opportunity flowed. Segregation did not need walls. It relied on rules, enforcement, and shared understanding. Healthcare revealed perhaps the most human cost of this system. Hospitals, clinics, and medical wards were separated, often leaving entire communities with limited or inadequate care. The consequences were not abstract. They were measured in untreated illnesses, delayed care, and preventable suffering. Yet even here, the system insisted on normalcy, presenting separation as orderly and necessary rather than harmful. The language of law masked the reality of unequal outcomes. Employment and public spaces completed the picture. Job opportunities were restricted by custom and regulation, confining many to roles defined by exclusion rather than ability. Parks, libraries, restaurants, theaters, and restrooms were divided, turning leisure itself into another reminder of separation. Even moments meant for rest or enjoyment were shaped by restriction, reinforcing a constant awareness of where one belonged and where one did not. What made this system so enduring was not only the laws that upheld it, but the way it blended into everyday routines. Segregation became something people navigated instinctively, adjusting behavior to avoid conflict or consequence. It taught compliance through repetition, and it punished deviation through enforcement. Over time, this way of life came to feel permanent, as though it had always existed and always would. Yet beneath that appearance of stability was a fragile truth. Jim Crow depended on constant reinforcement, legal approval, and social agreement. Its reach into transportation, education, housing, healthcare, work, and public life was vast, but it was never inevitable. It was built, maintained, and defended through decisions made again and again. Understanding how thoroughly it governed daily existence reveals not only the depth of its impact, but the magnitude of what it took to eventually dismantle it. Long before segregation was written into law, it had already been rehearsed on the stage. As the legal system prepared the ground for separation, popular culture was quietly shaping how people understood race, belonging, and worth. In the 19th century, a theatrical figure emerged that would outlive its performances and embed itself into the American imagination. This character, exaggerated and mocking, did not merely entertain audiences. It trained them. By presenting a distorted image of black life as humorous, simplistic, and inferior, it offered a cultural justification for the boundaries that laws would later enforce. The power of this character did not lie only in cruelty, but in familiarity. Audiences encountered it repeatedly, in songs, dances, and performances that framed ridicule as harmless fun. Over time, exaggeration hardened into assumption. What began as caricature became shorthand, a way for society to explain why separation felt reasonable, even necessary. So, when courts and lawmakers later spoke of difference, capability, or suitability, they were drawing from an image already planted deep in public consciousness. This is where culture and law intersected most effectively. The courts did not invent the idea of inferiority. They inherited it. By the time segregation was defended as orderly and rational, many Americans had already been conditioned to see inequality as natural. The stage had prepared the audience for the courtroom. A character designed to provoke laughter now served a darker purpose, reinforcing the notion that exclusion was not cruelty, but common sense. As Jim Crow expanded into daily life, this cultural legacy followed it everywhere. Signs dividing public spaces did not appear in a vacuum. They rested on stories people already believed. The image of black inferiority had been rehearsed so often that it no longer needed explanation. It lived in jokes, in language, in assumptions passed casually from one generation to the next. When schools were separated, when neighborhoods were restricted, when access to opportunity was denied, the reasoning felt familiar, even if it was rarely spoken aloud. What made this process especially insidious was its subtlety. Unlike laws, caricatures did not announce themselves as instruments of control. They disguised harm behind humor and tradition. By presenting inequality as amusing or harmless, they softened resistance and dulled moral discomfort. It became easier to accept separation when it aligned with images people had been taught to see as truth. This cultural conditioning also shaped how violations of segregation were perceived. When someone challenged the system, whether by sitting in the wrong place or demanding equal treatment, the response was not only legal or social, it was emotional. The challenge threatened a story people had grown comfortable believing. Resistance was framed not as a demand for fairness, but as disruption, an unsettling refusal to play the role assigned by history and culture. In this way, the caricature did more than demean. It disciplined. It taught society what to expect and how to react when expectations were challenged. It helped normalize the idea that some people belonged at the margins, and that enforcing those margins was not only acceptable, but necessary for order. By the time Jim Crow laws governed transportation, education, housing, and public life, the cultural groundwork had already done much of the work. Understanding this connection reveals why segregation endured for so long. It was not sustained by force alone, but by belief. Laws gave Jim Crow authority, but culture gave it legitimacy. The image born on the stage became a silent partner to the statute book, shaping attitudes that laws alone could not command. And yet, this also explains why dismantling Jim Crow required more than legal change. It demanded a confrontation with the stories that had justified exclusion for generations. To challenge segregation was to challenge the images, assumptions, and narratives that had made it feel normal. The legacy of that caricature reminds us that injustice does not begin with law. It begins with how a society chooses to see others, and how easily it accepts those visions as truth. As segregation hardened into law and routine, it became clear that statutes alone were not enough to sustain such a sweeping system. Jim Crow required something deeper than police power or court rulings. It needed daily cooperation, internalized discipline, Diekman, and a shared belief in hierarchy. This is where strict social rules came into play, shaping behavior in ways that were often unwritten but universally understood. These rules governed how people spoke, where they stood, how they looked at one another, and even what emotions they were permitted to express in public. They transformed segregation from a legal framework into a lived experience. Religion played a powerful role in this transformation. From pulpits and religious texts, distorted interpretations were used to present inequality as divinely sanctioned. Hierarchy was framed as destiny rather than design, discouraging questions and resistance by suggesting that social order reflected a higher plan. These messages did not need to be shouted. They were repeated gently, persistently, until they blended into moral common sense. Faith, which might have been a source of solidarity and justice, was instead used to quiet dissent and normalize separation. At the same time, pseudoscience offered what appeared to be rational confirmation of these beliefs. Measurements, classifications, and theories were presented as objective truth, lending an air of inevitability to inequality. By framing social hierarchy as the result of biology or natural order, these ideas removed responsibility from lawmakers and citizens alike. Segregation was no longer a choice, it was portrayed as a necessity. This illusion of scientific legitimacy made discrimination feel modern and informed rather than arbitrary or cruel. Media amplified these messages, weaving them into everyday life. Newspapers, advertisements, popular stories, Segregation, and entertainment repeated familiar themes that reinforced who belonged where and why. The repetition mattered. Over time, these portrayals shaped expectations, influencing how people interpreted behavior and intent. When someone challenged social boundaries, media narratives often framed such actions as inappropriate or disruptive rather than courageous. In this way, storytelling became a form of regulation, guiding public opinion without the need for formal enforcement. Political rhetoric completed the structure. Leaders spoke of order, stability, and tradition, carefully avoiding the language of harm while defending systems that excluded millions. By framing segregation as protective or necessary for social harmony, political speech masked inequality behind reassuring terms. These arguments appealed to fear of change and uncertainty, persuading many that maintaining separation was a responsible choice rather than a moral failure. Together, these forces created a powerful web of control. Social rules were enforced not only by authority figures, but by neighbors, employers, and even strangers. Compliance became a survival strategy, while deviation carried consequences that were unpredictable and often severe. The brilliance of the system, from the perspective of those who designed it, was its efficiency. It required constant participation, but little reflection. Once internalized, Ferguson, the rules policed themselves. This environment shaped identity as much as behavior. People learned early how much space they were allowed to occupy, how loudly they could speak, and when silence was safer than expression. These lessons were reinforced daily, not through dramatic confrontation, but through routine interaction. The result was a system that felt omnipresent yet invisible, shaping lives without always announcing its presence. Understanding Jim Crow solely as a collection of laws misses this deeper reality. It was a culture sustained by belief, habit, and repetition. Law provided the structure, but religion, pseudoscience, media, and political language gave it meaning and endurance. Together, they transformed inequality into something that appeared reasonable, even moral, to those who benefited from it. This is why dismantling Jim Crow required more than court decisions. It required challenging the stories people told themselves about order, worth, and belonging. It demanded a reckoning not only with unjust laws, but with the social rules that made those laws seem acceptable in the first place. As rigid as Jim Crow laws and social rules were, they did not stand on words alone. They were enforced through fear, through the knowledge that defiance carried consequences far beyond fines or arrest. Beatings, legal indifference, and thousands of documented lynchings formed the unspoken backbone of the system, ensuring that segregation was not merely observed, but obeyed. Violence functioned as a warning, a message delivered not just to individuals, but to entire communities, reminding them of the cost of crossing invisible lines. What made this terror especially powerful was its predictability. People understood that the justice system offered little protection. Law, enforcement, courts, and juries were often aligned with the very order being challenged, creating an environment where accountability was rare and silence was safer than protest. This imbalance taught a harsh lesson. Compliance was not agreement, but survival. The threat of harm lingered in everyday decisions, shaping behavior long before any law was cited or any sign was read. Lynchings, in particular, served a distinct purpose within this structure. They were meant to be seen, discussed, and remembered. Their function was not only punishment, but deterrence. The message was clear without being spoken aloud. The boundaries of Jim Crow were not suggestions, and those who tested them risked everything. Fear became a form of governance, one that required no legislation because its effects were already internalized. This climate of intimidation explains why segregation endured even when it was visibly unjust. The system relied on exhaustion as much as coercion, wearing people down through constant vigilance and restraint. Challenging Jim Crow required courage, but it also required accepting risks that few could afford to take. In this way, violence protected inequality by making resistance unbearably costly. And yet, history did not end there. Despite the terror, people continued to challenge the system, slowly and often at great personal risk. Each act of resistance carried the weight of those who came before, those who had faced consequences simply for asserting dignity. Understanding this context is essential, because it reveals how much was required to undo what Jim Crow had built. The eventual dismantling of segregation was not inevitable. It was earned through persistence, sacrifice, and an unwavering refusal to accept fear as destiny. The story of Jim Crow is not only about laws or rulings, but about power and how it is maintained. It shows how injustice can be normalized, how silence can be enforced, and how fear can be mistaken for order. Remembering this history matters, not as an exercise in blame, but as a lesson in vigilance. Systems built on exclusion rarely announce themselves as harmful. They present themselves as reasonable, traditional, or necessary, until their consequences become impossible to ignore. As we bring this chapter of the story to a close, thank you for staying with it. These conversations are not always comfortable, but they are important. If you found this exploration meaningful and believe stories like this deserve to be told, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep history alive, encourages deeper understanding, and ensures that lessons hard learned are not quietly forgotten. Lessons hard learned are not quietly forgotten.